So, welcome back everyone. If you remember from my last episode, we talked about the 9 essential items that you need in order to start in photography. Now you may have noticed I only started with the basics and I didn't go in great depth of each category. And I did that for a reason. Last time I asked you to make a decision on whether you wanted digital or whether you wanted film to start with. Now either is fine. I will say that I'll be teaching you film in the beginning, so it might not be a bad idea to start with that, but it's okay if you don't want to start in film. So if you're kind of confused on which camera to get, maybe you have picked film or maybe you have picked digital, but you're still confused on which to get, we're going to focus on 3 of each. So 3 film cameras and 3 digital cameras that are great for starter photography. All right, let's not waste any time because it's time to learn. All right, everyone, welcome back. I'm really excited for this episode because today we're going to talk about cameras. I love talking about cameras, but specifically, we're going to talk about 3 digital cameras and 3 film cameras. So first, let's talk about film cameras. All right, so first up, we're going to talk about the Canon AE-1. The Canon AE-1 is probably one of the most widely known 35mm beginner cameras because of its inexpensive price tag and its reliability. It has an internal light meter that runs off a battery, so with this camera you do have to have a battery in order for the camera to work, but it also has an auto mode for automatic shooting. While the settings are fairly limited, it does make the camera very easy to use. Now remember though, this is a purely manual focus camera, not auto, but I think it's good to learn with. There are also numerous lenses that you can get for this camera, which makes it pretty versatile. I would say that the 50mm 1.8 f-stop would be a great lens to start with. You can't change the focal length at all, but for learning purposes, it's really good. Most likely, you'd probably be able to snag one of these on eBay for around $200 with a lens. Now, just like with most film cameras, this is a little bit of an older camera. I think it launched in the 80s, so you're going to be buying it used. So make sure to just do your research when you're looking at the camera before you buy it to make sure there's no lens fog or scratches or anything like that. Now, here's a quick rundown of the specs. All right, so film camera number 2. This camera is Nikon's take on the Canon AE-1 that we just discussed earlier. Now this camera was also popular in the 80s, and it was an upgrade from the previous Nikon FE. Now, while this camera is a beginner camera, you could honestly argue that a professional could use it as well. The image quality is sharp, and the camera is very compact and light, which would make a great camera for street photography. Now the plus side to this camera, as opposed to the Canon, is you can shoot it without a battery. Now you may not have the internal light meter anymore at your disposal, but you can still shoot the camera without the battery. Now the really crazy thing about this camera is it is durable, but also it boasts a shutter speed of up to 1/4000th. That's unheard of for that time, and it kind of blows the Canon out of the water in that respect for action shots and things like that. Now this camera will probably set you back a little more than the Canon we previously discussed, especially with a comparable lens, and I'll probably say that's because of the awesome shutter speed. It'll probably set you back around $300 or so. Now again, you're going to be buying this camera used because, well, it's a camera from the 80s and it's as old as I am. Now here's a quick rundown of the specs. All right, film camera number 3. The Olympus OM-1. Originally named the M1, the OM-1 was renamed later on because of its cousin, the Leica M1 rangefinder. Leica got into a little bit of a spat over the name with Olympus, so Olympus caved and they renamed it to the OM-1. You can still find some of the M1s floating around, but since there are only about 5,000 made, you'd be hard-pressed to find one. But on to more important information. Now this camera is purely mechanical in nature. Unlike the other 2 cameras, this one does not have an auto exposure. It does have a light meter, and it's a very basic center-weighted plus-minus light meter, but it'll get the job done. Now, 2 really cool things that this camera has that the other 2 don't is 1, it has a really large viewfinder, and 2, stylistically they chose to give you a ring near the base of the lens and the body of the camera where you could change the shutter and the aperture. This camera truly is a no-frills, compact 35mm beginner camera, but it won't set you back as much as the other 2 we previously discussed. You can probably score one of these little cameras for around $100 with a lens. Let's take a look at the quick rundown of the specs. Alright, now on to the digital cameras. Digital camera number 1, the Nikon D3500. Time and time again, this DSLR is known to be a top-notch, reasonably priced camera with some really great specs. Even though this camera is not mirrorless, it is fairly compact and lightweight. Also, this camera does boast a 24 megapixel APS-C sensor. This camera is known to be lightweight and easy to use, making it a great beginner camera. You can get one of these cameras brand new with an 18 to 55mm lens for around $500. Let's take a look at the specs. Alright, on to digital camera number 2, the Canon Rebel SL3. This Canon is probably one of the smallest and most lightweight of their EOS line, making it a great travel and street photography camera. So this camera does have something I particularly enjoy, especially as a short photographer. It has an LCD that can pop out from the back of the camera and you can change the angle of it. Similar to the Nikon, it does have a 24 megapixel sensor, but unlike the Nikon, it can shoot in 4K video. The Nikon can only shoot in 1080p. I will say though, for comparing the two, that the autofocus on the Nikon is going to be a little quicker than on the Canon. Now, this camera, due to some of the really cool features it has, will set you back a little more than the Nikon at about $750 for a comparable lens of a focal length of 18 to 55mm. Let's look at the specs. Alright, last but not least, digital camera number 3, the Sony A6000. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention a mirrorless camera, as the other two cameras were DSLR. Now, this mirrorless camera has a blazing fast autofocus, and even better, it's at a cheaper price point than its predecessor. Being mirrorless does mean it's more compact and lightweight. However, the downside is that typically, just like with most mirrorless cameras, the battery life is not going to be as good as the previous two cameras we discussed. I will say though that this Sony does have better battery life than a lot of the other mirrorless cameras out there, which is part of the reason I chose it. Now, the downside is that the autofocus, while is very quick, the burst mode does struggle to keep up when you're trying to shoot images back to back. Similar to the last two cameras we discussed, this also has a 24 megapixel sensor with similar ISO range. So if you're looking for a very compact, lightweight, and super fast mirrorless camera, this may be a good camera for you. Let's look at the rundown of the specs. Alright, that's it. So today we discussed the 6 cameras that I wanted to go over, 3 of them being film and 3 of them being digital. Now, there are pros and cons to each of these cameras, and honestly, after doing a little bit of your research, you may not even choose one of them. This is my personal opinion on what I think would be good starter cameras for you. Now, there are particular things that I like to see on my camera. For instance, I like the articulated LCD screen on the back of some cameras. Now, all cameras have that, and to be honest, the camera I'm shooting with right now doesn't have it, and I do kind of miss that. I also like to see good battery life, something that's somewhat lightweight and compact for travel, and has really good light sensitivity or ISO range. Again, this is going to be personal opinion, but any of these cameras I feel would be great beginner cameras. Okay. Like I said before, any time that you're buying used, you have to make sure that you're checking the equipment before you buy it. Sometimes it's a little hard to do, so you have to look very closely at the images if you're buying online. Check for things like scratches, dents, evidence of it being dropped or exposed to any type of moisture in the lens or fog or fungus, things like that. Remember, used is good though because your wallet will thank you. They are going to be less expensive than buying new, but if you're particularly like buying new, then you're going to probably have to go with a digital because the cameras I discussed with the film are old and they're not available new anymore. Everyone, thank you so much for sticking around for episode 2, but of course, as always, there will be more to come, so check out episode 3. Also, if you're looking for cool gear, as always, like the shirt that I'm wearing today, please check out my website. I'm always adding new stuff. All right, everyone, I just want to say thank you so much, and don't forget, please stick around for my next episode. We're going to talk about learning how to shoot with your newly purchased 35mm camera. Thanks, everyone.